So when the track fades out, does that mean there's another track coming, or it actually is the thing? Well, it actually is the thing. Welcome, everyone. This is your sort of a pre-welcome welcome. My name's Joe Bennett. I'm going to be lurking in the background on the tech. So my only two comments are, if there's any tech issues with hearing folks or with screen sharing, please message me direct in the chat. And the second thing to say is any comments generally on any speakers or any questions that occur to you, please use the chat. We want it to be as interactive as possible today. On the Zoom etiquette, we're requesting cameras on wherever possible. I know we've got at least one participant on a moving train, but just to try and create a sense of community, that's a desirable way of working when we're all limited by this medium. That's it on the housekeeping. We will be, it's now 11 a.m. US Eastern Time, 3 p.m. UTC, and we will be finishing 91 minutes from now. So I'm going to hand over to Laurie.
Well, thank you, and welcome everyone. I think first we would like to hear from Veronica, just a few maybe teasers for some of the announcements that are going to come at the end of the show.
Yes, so just because we know sometimes people have to head off a bit early, we thought we'll start by giving you the headlines and then return to them a bit more in detail towards the end. The session is being recorded and we will publish it on our site, musicproductionresearch.org, if you want to kind of review it or if you missed the end bit. So as we said, welcome. We're thrilled to see everyone here and the continued engagement and the increasing numbers as well. It's been wonderful to see. The exciting stuff is we might not be limited by this medium for too much longer. But first of all, we are launching a journal, which we're very excited about. The call for papers is up now on the site as well, musicproductionresearch.org. If you click on JMPR at the top, it'll take you to the details and the call for submissions, which I believe Joe is loading for us now. There we are. So the call for submission takes you to the link, which includes guidelines as well. There we go. So the deadline is for the 26th of January, with due for publication summer 2024. We're hopefully aiming for the early summer, but giving us a bit of leeway there just in case. So if that's something you're interested in, please have a look through that and please submit your work. Hopefully we can get a really good issue going there as an inaugural issue. Secondly, like we said, hopefully we're moving beyond just the online. We have our first in-person conference in the works. So it will take place the 13th to the 15th of September 2024. So still a little while away, but it's coming. And as you can see, it'll be at Leeds Beckett University. So we're very, very excited about that. Call for papers to follow probably around February time. So keep your eyes out for that. And again, we're very excited about these developments. So Laurie, if you want to kick off.
Thank you. So good day and welcome to this virtual panel presentation. Perhaps you attended the inaugural event in June, at which we celebrated over a dozen recent books that illustrate the range of research in the field and demonstrate the need for this very society. Today we focus on a rather pointed theme, maybe you could say edgy theme in music production research. The topic is distortion and disruption in music production. We've invited three speakers, Austin Moore, Jen Dugenio, and Gary Brumham, to form this panel, and they each represent different disciplinary and practical approaches to the field. That diversity of perspective that you're going to witness today is another hallmark of this society, where we wish to put scholarly, practice-based, and business models into dialogue. We will run this like a typical conference panel. Each panelist will present, followed by questions. I'll aim to keep us on time, and Joe will help as well with that. So let's begin. While I'm talking, perhaps Austin could set up his slides. Austin Moore is a senior lecturer and course leader of sound engineering and music production at the University of Huddersfield. His PhD thesis was an investigation into nonlinear sonic signatures with a focus on dynamic range compression and the 1176 FET compressor. Current research interests include music production, sonic signatures, Atmos in music production, the user experience, semantic audio. He has a background in the music industry and spent many years producing and remixing various forms of electronic dance music. His book, Distortion in Music Production, co-edited with Gary Brumham, is available through Routledge. So welcome, Austin, and we look forward to hearing you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for that introduction, Laurie. That was very, very nice of you. And yeah, today I'm gonna start the first presentation, which is going to focus specifically on distortion pedals. Now, the kind of findings from this research can also apply to all forms of distortion in music production. But the kind of focus and the motivation for this research project was to investigate the sort of sonic character of 4 iconic pedals. The reason why I've always been interested in distortion as a kind of research area is because it's, pun firmly intended here, it saturates the landscape of music production and has for a long period of time. It's played an integral role in shaping the sonics of certain bands, certain songs. We've heard Revolution by the Beatles there that wouldn't be the same song without that distorted guitar sound. But also it's birthed specific genres. Drum and bass just springs to mind. I guess heavy metal and rock are the obvious genres. So that's the kind of overarching motivation for studying distortion. For this particular project, I really wanted to explore these 4 iconic pedals and try and get a handle on their sonic character, the descriptors used to describe them, and also trying to get an understanding of those descriptors at a more objective level. The 4 pedals in question, probably very familiar to any guitar players in here, are the Ibanez Tube Screamer up here at the top left quadrant in green. The Boss DS1, we can see the orange pedal, the Big Muff pedal, and the Rat pedal. Now, all of these pedals have very different design approaches, which affects the sonic character. It could be argued that in order from clean to distorted, let's just say, we could probably go from the Tube Screamer up to the Rat, up to the DS1, and then finally the Big Muff. We'll just hear a short little extract of each of these pedals, just to give you sort of a flavor of the sound quality. And this audio was used as part of the stimuli for a listening experiment, which I'll explain as we get into the slide presentation. So this is a clean signal straight through a Fender Deluxe Reverb. We now have the Tube Screamer into the Rat. Into the DS1. And finally into the Muff. Okay, so you're probably listening to that Muff and thinking, well, that's not heavily distorted. Well, we're just listening to, at the minute, we're listening to the lower gain settings from these pedals, and we'll have an opportunity to hear how the character changes of those pedals as we increase the gain. So just going into a little bit more detail on the particular study. So yeah, as I kind of hinted at previously, the study aimed to conduct a comprehensive analysis of the language used to describe distortion pedals. We wanted to construct a lexicon that encompassed not only specific characteristics of those pedals, but could also be used in the broader kind of domain of distortion in music production. And in actual fact, I've got some further research projects that are investigating that at the moment. The objectives through content analysis and text mining extract descriptors from online social media discussions and pedal reviews. So it's kind of a form of netography. Then to explore the results from that further with a different lens, we utilized a listening experiment to directly elicit descriptors from guitar players. That was to enhance the authenticity of our findings and kind of double check it with the previous study. And then the final stage, and there actually are other stages of this study, but I'm only going through the 3 steps today, was to use some clustering approaches to look for similarities between these terms and see if we could see any similarities between those terms, which would help us give objective meaning to them. Okay, so the first stage was the content analysis text mining method. We identified several social media groups and Qatar forums and relevant threads relating to a distortion pedal. So those included Qatar forums, Reddit discussion threads, Facebook discussion threads. So all kinds of social media where Qatar players were discussing these pedals, and we would find discussions relating to these particular pedals and also pedals in general. To do that work, we developed a kind of bespoke script for R, which was like, I probably shouldn't say it, but was a web scraping script, so we could scrape the web, scrape all the discussions right into a CSV file, and then we could comb through those to find patterns emerging in the discussions. So a bit of housekeeping. We use some automated scripts within R to kind of sift through the words and leave only words that were descriptors. And then we had to do a little bit of manual housekeeping where we would also remove words where they weren't actually describing the sound quality, but words such as versatile, expensive, and so on. The final set of descriptors also only used words that appeared more than once. So we didn't include single-use descriptors, but we did set them aside for potential discussion later on at a later stage of the research. So the overall results, as we can see at the top, we have crunchy, which was the most common term. That was followed by noisy. Then we had warm, dirty, full, smooth, hot, thick, fat, fuzzy, muddy, thin, bright, harsh, creamy, dark, crispy, fizzy, woolly, and sludgy. So quite an interesting term collection of descriptors. So crunchy emerged right at the top, and we could probably argue that probably part of that popularity is due to the prevalence of crunch channels on amplifiers. Many amplifiers have got a crunch channel, and as became quite a common term to use. Noisy ranked as the second most descriptor, but we were able to actually get in and look at these discussions and actually kind of look at the context of the word and how it was used. And when we did that, we found that most of the time that noisy was used to describe the kind of the signal to noise ratio, the noise floor in the pedal, particularly when operated at high gains, and particularly for the Boss DS1, which if anybody's used that pedal entering the gain knob, it can get quite noisy. So the third most popular descriptor, and a bit of a hat tip over to Gary himself here, was warm, and that was pretty much almost anticipated by us. We had a feeling that warm was going to come fairly high up the list, and warm is often considered to be a reduction of brightness, which can lead to this perceived warmth. Dirty was the fourth most frequently used descriptor. Again, looking at the discussions surrounding that descriptor, it was typically connected to high gain distortion styles, particularly distortion styles that resembled maybe grunge styles, not so much modern metal styles, that kind of tight high gain style. Creamy was a fairly subjective term, but our analysis of those discussions around that term seemed to suggest that it was a distortion that was fairly smooth across the frequency band. There weren't any spiky frequencies in that distortion character. And I keep mentioning there was two researchers that did this work in order to ensure that we had no bias. We both did this independently and then combined the results to check that there was no intercoder bias. Okay, we then looked at and grouped these descriptors into what we came up with two categories, well, a third category: positive descriptions, negative descriptions, and then descriptions where it was kind of on the fence, where we couldn't quite tell. They could be positive, they could be negative, depending upon the context. So crunchy, warm, dirty, full, smooth, hot, thick, fat, creamy, crispy were all descriptors that we use in a positive context. And in negative context, noisy, as I described previously, with the noise from the Boss DS1, for example, a muddy distortion, a thin distortion, a harsh distortion, a fuzzy distortion, a woolly distortion, were all negative descriptors. Things that were on the fence, sometimes fuzzy was good, depending upon the context. Sometimes fuzzy was bad. Sometimes bright was good, sometimes bright was bad. You get the idea. So these were descriptors where they were often used either positive or negative. When you look at the results by pedal, I'm going to go through these reasonably quickly, but we'll see for the Tube Screamer, crunchy stands out at the top for that particular pedal. That is likely to do with the style of clipping in that pedal, which is a kind of soft clipping approach. And because of the filters in the design, the distortion is focused in the mid-range. So arguably, crunchy could be a mid-range focused style of distortion. Gritty, dirty, noisy were frequently employed in the context of the higher gain settings, but they were usually used to say it can get dirty, or it can get gritty, or it can get noisy when used in higher gain settings. In terms of the DS1, noisy was the top descriptor, and it usually described the noise from that pedal when used in high gain settings. But following on from that, warm, full, crunchy, dirty, harsh, muddy, and so on with the other descriptors. It's interesting to note that approximately 44% of the descriptors pointed towards a harder, more harsh style of clipping. And that's kind of noteworthy because DS1 uses a hard clipping style in its circuit. Interestingly, warm emerges as the second most popular descriptor, and one could argue that its usage is driven out of familiarity more than anything else, right? Because we kind of identified that is often the descriptor, the default descriptor to describe distortion. And I guess we could kind of substantiate that claim by saying, well, dark, which is we'll see towards the end of the slide, which appears to be almost a synonym for warm, was used very infrequently. Also worth noting is that the tone control on this particular pedal has a fair amount of scope, and there can be a great deal of variation in the distortion character. So that's why we've got a broad range of kind of descriptors for this particular pedal. The Rat, dirty, comes up trumps here. Thick, fuzzy, smooth, warm. And this again aligns with the hard clipping style. Other descriptors such as thick, fuzzy, warm, smooth, fat, again, were used collectively to give the impression that this has got a palette of distortion that is perceived as being fairly positive, okay, because these descriptors are coming from the positive group of descriptors. And in textual analysis, we observed that negative descriptors were typically used to describe this one under low gain settings. Finally, for the Big Muff, fuzzy, noisy, bassy, thick, smooth, and so on and so forth. It's worth highlighting that a significant portion of these descriptors convey a thick character, predominantly centered around the lower end of the frequency spectrum. And this, again, is because of how the Big Muff pedal works. So it will accentuate the distortion on that lower end. Textual analysis will reveal that descriptors such as thin, crunchy, and bright were often used actually to describe what the pedal is not. So this is something that's definitely worthwhile when you carry out this research. You have to read the context to get an understanding of the context of the use of descriptors. On to stage 2. So the initial stage collected these descriptors from online sources, but the problem is primarily based upon the person typing the message's memory. Yeah, and in subsequent studies, we wanted to present blind audio examples of the sound produced by each pedal. It used an online format, an online study survey format. We embedded the audio clips, and comment boxes were provided for participants to give their input. And we wanted to kind of cross-reference the results with the previous study. The material was recorded into a deluxe reverb. It was reamped into deluxe reverb through the pedals in question with varying amounts of gain. It was captured with a 57 microphone, and I believe we captured that at 48 kilohertz, 24-bit. Participants were asked to provide 3 descriptors for each of the pieces of audio, and we ended up getting 11 experienced guitar players from around the world to take part in this, and all the audio material was level matched to minus 15 LUFS. So, we wanted to look at it by pedal, but the kind of the response rate by pedal was quite low. So we kind of changed the focus a little bit with this one because we had given them stimuli over low, medium, and high gain settings. So this is why I'm focusing on the low, medium, and high gain descriptors here, so we can look at those descriptors at a kind of a lower level over those gain settings. For lower gain descriptors, warm, crunchy, thin, overdrive, they come out as descriptors that were used. Crunchy seems to be popular in this context. We could argue that overdriven is used out of familiarity with low gain settings. So yeah, that's our list of descriptors for the low gain. And this is giving you a refresher of these pedals with low gain settings. This is going into the Tube Screamer. This is going to go into the Rat. It's going to go into the DS1. Finally into the Muff. So moving on to the medium descriptors, the most prevalent descriptor here was driven. Perhaps we could say that the participants were starting to spot these were more driven gain settings. That could be one argument for that descriptor being popular. Descriptors like full, compress, fuzzy were also commonly employed by the participants. And this kind of usage pattern suggests that listeners perceive the characteristics of sort of moderately aggressive clipping, signal compression, and an increase in harmonics by the point we get to medium gain settings. Again, a refresher of these pedals with the medium gain settings. Sorry, I sped up the transition with the gain settings as I came towards the end of the presentation. And over high gain, most frequently encountered descriptors we can see here: saturated, fuzzy. Interestingly, full wasn't included here because one might have thought that we would go to full and fuller, and we would just keep getting fuller with a distortion, but that didn't seem to be the case. Fuzzy was not just used for the big muff, it was used across all of the distortion pedals. We expected it just to be the big muff, but it was all the pedals. And that would suggest that this high gain guitar tones are perceived as both saturated and as full and fuzzy, perhaps challenging the assumption that higher gain settings lead to increased fullness. So what we found is low gain, we could argue, ranges from warm to crunchy. Mid gain ranges from full to fuzzy, and high gain ranges from saturated to mid gain full to fuzzy, high gain saturated to fuzzy. Okay, so these are the descriptors from both studies. I'll not spend too much time on these now, but we've put them into two categories, common to both studies, unique to one of the studies. The descriptors common to both the studies, so these are the descriptors that came up in both of the studies that we carried out, were crunchy, fizzy, fuzzy, thin, warm, full, dark, fat, muddy, dirty, smooth, and thick. Final stage. Without going into detail on how we did this, we got participants to rate the similarity of these words in the similarity matrix. We took all of their responses and we averaged them out, and we used an R script to calculate this dendrogram. So what we see in here in the dendrogram is that the words here in this branch of the dendrogram are more closely related, for example, than words in this branch of the dendrogram, okay? The ones that we've highlighted are kind of groups. Yeah, we can see going across, we've got noisy, fizzy, and harsh clustering together, suggesting similarity in those words. Dirty, fuzzy, hot, dirty, hot, and fuzzy clustering together. Crunchy and crispy clustering together. Muddy and woolly clustering together. Warm and dark, as I said previously, clustering together. Thick and full clustering together. Thick and fat, rather, clustering together. And then creamy and full clustering together. And then as we go further up the branch, those smaller clusters will then group into those terms, suggesting again similarity between those terms. So text mining process yielded a substantial amount of textual data for our analysis. The limitation was those descriptors were reliant on memory, which is probably going to cause some subjectivity. The descriptors from the listening experiment offered a more focused approach to discerning the distinctions and the characteristics. We observed a good degree of similarity between these descriptors collected in both studies, suggesting these terms we could argue constitute the core lexicon. And then through this clustering analysis, we identified the similarities of terms, facilitating their grouping and initiating the process of attributing meaning to these descriptors. And further work is being carried out in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Should have
Um,
some applause queued up as an audio cue, but I guess we
Mm.
can do that with our mics unmuted, can't we?
Thank you. That's 19 minutes and 9 seconds. So I think I didn't do too
Very
bad.
nice. So we could go to questions. I can think of a lot if people are not going to jump in. I'm happy to jump in, but anybody with a raised hand, I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
What was that, Christian? Did Christian have a raised hand, or was that okay, that was just a wave. Bit of cardio.
Well, I'll start the ball rolling if I could. This is really interesting, and I remember long ago having a great conversation with Gary Brumham about the need for lexicon to be able to describe some of these terms that we throw around. And I put them into articles, and then I get the peer review back saying, "What do you mean by gritty?" Like we need some. We do need this lexicon, and we need to have some standards for how we use the terms. But I'm wondering, Austin, if you were to try to deliver this as a pedagogical, with a pedagogical interest, to try to teach people to be able to mobilize these terms in a way that is consistent, so that we're in a room together and we are using these terms fairly consistently, based on parameters that are well defined, like low gain and different levels of articulation and all that kind of thing. How can you see this as a pedagogical tool for beginning to train the field to speak consistently?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, it's I teach a module here at Huddersfield, which is critical listening for the sound engineer, and as part of that module, we focus on specific attributes of sound. And with my interest in distortion, we do a lot of listening to distortion, and when I produce stimuli for the students to listen to, I can kind of distort them in certain ways to focus on different bands, et cetera, et cetera. So those stimuli can be then used to kind of stimulate the discussion around these terms. So that's how I've been using them within my teaching. It's quite interesting that actually, as part of this project, we got in contact with some local pedal manufacturers, and we just kind of discussed with them, what do you think, what attributes of the pedal design do you think is giving it a crunchy sound or a fuzzy sound, and that again was kind of crossing over into, I guess, the kind of more professional practitioner perspective, but we were getting their viewpoint on it as well. What part of your design process do you think is impacting the distortion character? And again, feeding that back into these discussions with students during the critical listening, where we can kind of objectively define, what it is about the sound that is generating this perceptual effect on the listener, which is kind of drawn into what you're saying, Laurie, which is, you're getting things back from peer reviews saying, well, what exactly do you mean by crispy, or what exactly do you mean by crunchy? And that was one of the things that, that we have that discussion many times, and I'm sure Gary has that discussion many times with colleagues, where they want to have complete objective meaning of these terms. And I think the more that we can do to create that, that objective meaning through these lexicon, I think the more we can do, the better. And as I said, we've kind of got some further work in that area, but I use this as a tool when teaching critical listening. I think the more that we can agree upon the terms, the better, and it helps people to identify what they're listening for.
Right. And you're doing us a favor, because you're giving us a citable source to be able to say, see, there are quantifiable and qualitative ways to discuss these terms. So thank you for that work.
So I have a quick question, Austin. Again, I invite colleagues to paste any questions that you have in the chat for any of our presenters. Makes it easier for Laurie and others to collate them. But yeah, so my question is, did you have the opportunity to collect metadata about the people? That is, were responses different if they were or were not a guitar player, were or were not a producer? And my secondary question relates to the tech. Did you control for EQ? Because obviously all of those pedals have a tone control, or most of them do. And how did you run into that as a control group challenge?
Yeah, the first one. I mean, that's straight away. That's quite a tricky one. With as you've identified that the tone control, we can get a fair amount of variation of some of the pedals over the tone control. What we tried to do is keep the tone control as flat as we could as possible by, often the noon position in some of these pedals will be a kind of cut or a boost. We tried to keep it in a kind of reasonably moderate position in terms of what the tone controller was doing. But you're right, yeah, we could have had a number of different stimuli off each of the different tone positions on those pedals. So it's a tricky one. It's just a case of trying to limit the amount of material that listeners are going to be exposed to, Joe. Yeah, a larger study. Future work, if anybody wants to do it, could be to go through with the different tone controls, with the different gain settings, and see what comes out. The other question on as part of the text mining, we were targeting guitar forums and discussions with guitar players. It's kind of impossible to tell the level of experience and so on from that. So they were all guitar players, and again, then with the second stage, the listen experiment, they were all experienced guitar players. I think I'm sort of racking my brains here. I think we probably had some sort of selection criteria that maybe they had to have exposure with the pedals and so many years experience playing guitars. We were trying to get people that were pretty familiar with these sounds and pretty familiar with the kind of range of distortion that was available.
We have a question in the chat. Was any signal analysis used to correlate descriptive terms? Like, read it for yourself there, Austin.
No, that's a second stage, or sorry, that's what we haven't done yet. Yeah, but we were looking to do some sort of low-level audio extraction on that to kind of correlate. Yeah, that's the way to go for the second stage of it. So this is more just a qualitative stage. The second stage is going to be much more quantitative. So yeah, audio feature extraction to see any correlation between those descriptors.
I'm wondering, Joe, if we really have time for any more questions. We might need to cook along here. I do see another question. It was one that occurred to me too. But how are we for time, Joe?
We're about 2 minutes behind time. So Austin, can you knock this one out the park super fast?
Depends what it is. Go for it, Joe.
Regarding the assignment, it's a question from Dennis. Dennis, regarding the assignment of descriptors to positive, negative categories, how was that assignment made?
So in terms of we looked at the texts. So we looked at the discussion surrounding the descriptors in those texts, and then we were kind of able to map them from positive to negative. There was a little bit of subjectivity in that, to be perfectly honest, but we tried again the same thing. The two coders worked independently and then came together to try and reduce any bias that was in there. But yeah, that was the process that we had from that one.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and I'm sure we could keep talking about this, but we should keep our schedule. So thank you very much, Austin. And while I'm introducing you, Jen, if you want to share your screen, I will introduce you. Jen Dugenio is the founder and president of the U.S. nonprofit organization Women in Vinyl, co-host of the Women in Vinyl podcast, and the sales and customer service director at Gold Rush Vinyl. Previous roles include sales manager for Furnace Record Pressing and career advisor for Savannah College of Art and Design in the US. Her passion for vinyl has led her to a career in helping to manufacture the physical product for bands, working with both major and independent record labels. In launching Women in Vinyl, Jen combines her love of vinyl and career advising to empower women and underrepresented people in this industry to achieve their goals and find a career path. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to kind of change gears and talk about disruption and diversification in a different way in what we've done with Women in Vinyl. So to start, an introduction, we started in 2018 to disrupt the vinyl industry by raising women's voices to the forefront of what is historically a male-dominated field. I didn't know growing up that there were opportunities for me in the music industry because I did not play an instrument. And so I really felt that this was important to showcase people like me and other women, LGBTQ, Black and Indigenous people of color, doing these jobs and paving the way and really create a community around this in order to provide resources for all aspects of the career paths within such an amazing space. So our main core mission, vision, and values are to educate, demystify, and diversify. We educate through various platforms where we seek to inspire and create these role models that I mentioned. And we're dedicated to career development through resources and expanding the visibility and options that are out there and available. We create opportunities and knowledge through mentorship. We highlight employment and informational white papers and collaborate with similar communities, which, again, thank you for having us here today. We demystify by presenting resources and industry insider information through our blog and through our podcast. We better educate and create refined understanding of the vinyl community and what its terminology actually is. I'll mention later, but vinyl is the #1 medium which people are consuming through physical media. And so it's so important that we start going back and making people really understand the terminology, what they're getting, what they should expect when they're listening to records. And then how we're going to innovate this industry, because we've been doing it the same way forever. Yes, there was a resurgence, but the machines and a lot of the technologies are the same as they have been forever. We create accessible tools, video tutorials, statistical reports and discussions. And then, of course, we empower women to speak with confidence and share their stories and successes through career development and creating safe spaces. So why is this important? Well, a couple really interesting statistics that you'll see here on this side is 42% of women and almost 100% of transgender individuals in the industry say that they don't have access to professional training and development opportunities, and that's a problem. There are a lot of barriers to entry as well, and industry professionals actually said that they might not do this if they didn't have some of the resources that are coming available. And then mentorships, they prove to be beneficial. 93% of respondents felt that mentoring had really contributed to their advancement in this industry and the opportunities that they now have available. So again, physical media and vinyl are now outselling CDs. It's the #1 way that people are consuming their music. And the thing about vinyl manufacturing and all of the steps involved in that process outside of your engineering are actual trade opportunities for education. There's nowhere you can go to school and learn to cut a lacquer or electroplate or press a record. And that's something that's kind of blue sky goal for us, is to get into some of these educational spaces and really teach what these opportunities are and create potential curriculum-based studies around them so that people know that there are these other pathways. Otherwise, we can't innovate if we aren't diversifying and creating a space for people to learn these outside of just trade. Some of the things that we did this year, so we were able to actually put into place a internship that was hands-on in vinyl manufacturing. So we had 3 interns at Gold Rush Vinyl in Austin, Texas, where they got to learn to press records, the QC process, everything from once the stampers arrived to pack out and finishing. And from that, we actually had one of them hired full-time as a press operator. So it's really putting our mission into direct fulfillment, which is really exciting to see. We also continue to educate. So Etienne works at Bandcamp. They're actually working on the vinyl side of Bandcamp and had no understanding of actually how vinyl was made when they got into this role. And so we sent them to Making Vinyl, which is an industry conference, and allowed them to really understand holistically from all sorts of different people how vinyl is made, and then took that back into their day-to-day career. We also created a scholarship to a lathe cut camp. This was a chance for hands-on experience to learn how to cut records. Lathe cutting is a little bit different from lacquer cutting, but there is a really expensive barrier to entry. And so allowing people to go and test this out and see if it's something that they wanted to do was a really exciting opportunity there as well. And then we created a scholarship with Berkeley Online that we're focusing specifically on physical media. to allow for opportunities outside of marketing, digital mastering, and some of the things that most universities are carrying when it comes to educational opportunities. Because again, there are all of these other things within physical media that we need to start training people on. We also continue to diversify and demystify by being at various conferences. There's actually about an 80-20 female to male attendance. And so we really need to be present and again, show people that women are in this industry and paving the way for a lot of different areas within it. For example, the, gem stylus that's used to cut lathes was actually created by a woman who was using a pen name of a male. And so in our history of women in vinyl that we have on our website and our resources, we talk about some of these women who really were crucial to how manufacturing vinyl is made today. And so what we aim to continue to do, we're really challenging our higher education friends and partners to make scholarship programs annual and expand into the physical media disciplines. We're going to curate and hold info sessions with industry speakers because we found a lot of people that applied to our scholarship opportunities really just needed that initial baseline to better find which way they may want to go within these career opportunities. So we hope to hold that coming up. We will continue to be present at our industry conferences and expand outside of those. We're creating tutorials and master classes. We actually have a book that's coming out again through Routledge. So hopefully that will be in early next year. We're just finalizing some details at this point, but that will be where we are sharing educational synopsis of each career path within the vinyl industry, and then showcasing 5 women who are working in that field and how they found their way there and what they love most about their job and some of the difficulties that they find in it as well. We're continuing to formalize and work out details with trade programs. We're further expanding the community and reaching internationally so that we can continue to create other chapters and innovate worldwide. And then we're continuing to enhance and expand our online resources so that we have these white papers, especially coming from the book, where people can learn more about how all of the process is made. I find that on the consumer level, working day to day in vinyl manufacturing, there's so much misinformation out there. And there are so many things that we have to just start from scratch with explaining what certain terminology is to even make sure that they understand what they're buying. And so from consumer to people who want to work in this industry, it's really important that we do that. Just a quick overview of our reach. We are really, our main platform continues to be Instagram. People really find us there and the tools that we provide available useful in that platform. And then we featured over 202 women. We feature someone every Saturday, so that continues to grow. When I started this in 2018, just interviewing women that I worked with who were putting out records at various record labels, I never thought that it would grow to what it is now. But coming from higher education, I always knew that I wanted to make it a nonprofit and an educational aspect. And so it's exciting to see that it was so needed and that it continues to be a space that is wanted. I share this not to show really our reach, but I find it interesting that the amount of men that are learning from the Women in Vinyl, organization as a whole is more than the women. And so that just continues to show sort of where that percentage lies in men versus women in the vinyl industry and how we're really trying to continue to push that to be a 50-50 split and then maybe even past that. So what we continue to look for and what we hope to do is expand through sponsorship and donations. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we do hope that we can continue to do master classes, work with groups like this and continue to get the message out there and educate further on the vinyl industry and everything that's available with it. Some of our resources for you to check out later. We have editorial features. We have our job board where we focus jobs on anything that is related to physical media, our history of women in vinyl, our directory of women-owned record stores, and then some how-tos, so how to start a record label, tips for digital mastering, and what the electroplating process is. Our board, we have expanded it this year, so we have an advisory board, which Veronica is on, and then we also have our executive board and board of directors. We created a really diverse group of people so that we make sure that we're not focusing on just one area within physical media. So everything from working in pressing plants to metadata, cutting, electroplating, and lathe cutting. So really across the board and beyond, with Grammy Award winning engineers as well. The podcast is another thing I want to mention, just because of the reach, and in hopes that after we're done here today, you might check it out and really learn more about everything that I'm talking about. We cover from Vinyl 101, where you're holding a record and you're like, this is what a dead wax etch is, this is how much music can fit on a side, to getting into the nitty gritty and some of our tech talks about, you know, specifics of mastering engineers, how cutting for vinyl is different than your regular audio masters, what electroplating is, and more. So we also interview people during these podcast episodes on all kinds of topics. We had John Sheldenko, who found a hidden White House archive of thousands of sealed records that are just sitting there in a storage unit, and he was able to create this historical sort of unboxing of all of these amazing records, and he's hoping to now bring it up to date because it stopped back in the 80s, and so think of all the music since then to add to it. So all kinds of really interesting topics, and it is worldwide. Yeah, and we'll hope that you'll check that out. And so again, just some other places to find us, and we look forward to breaking boundaries with you.
Thank you very much. Such an interesting industry perspective that you've brought to us, and I really appreciate the broadening of the discussion here. I'll look for people to jump in. Veronica, do you want to ask your question? Go ahead.
Yes. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that in being this disruptor in the vinyl industry, what's the general response to that? Like going to these industry specific conferences, do you find that people are a bit resistant towards it, or is it much more welcoming and kind of wanting to see those changes in the industry?
Within vinyl specifically, like Making Vinyl, Music Biz, some of those types of organizations, Record Store Day Camp, it's definitely welcomed. Everybody is really excited, and it's part of the reason why we've been able to grow, is just how responsive and needed that it was. Where we find some pushback is this old school style of thinking, where we'll talk to people and they're just like, what do they actually want to ask us on the podcast? Is it going to be, you know, just kind of a silly topic? And I don't think they understand that we are the women in vinyl dispensing this information, but we're not narrowing down the community to just women. Men need to be educated on a lot of this information as well. And so it's a little bit more in the audiophile community where we've had a little bit more trouble sort of breaking in and getting that inclusion. Just because it's such a sort of old school way of thinking.
Thank you.
I'll jump in with something. So it's really interesting, this whole question of the technology that plays back the vinyl for us. You're saying it hasn't really changed, while the actual methods of cutting the vinyl and honing this material seems to be changing. what's the future in that? What are you seeing as where the puck is going?
There's so much innovation and room for it within the vinyl industry. For example, in 2020, there are 2 lacquer manufacturers in the world. One is in Japan and one was in California. The California facility that also used or created the diamond heads for cutting had a massive fire and literally exploded. And so we now worldwide have 1 lacquer manufacturer. It's hard to explain the scope of what would happen if anything happened to that. Direct to metal mastering is not something that's available within the US, which means we cut down the ability to create our lacquers or our initial step to electroplating and pressing records significantly. So right there is something that we need innovation in. And then while a lot of the actual press manufacturers are working on, automations and things within computer software that help speed up the process, it's still a 20 to 30 second cycle time per record. And then you have, manual QC still and everything involved in that. So, there's space there. We actually just posted a podcast episode today talking to Green Vinyl, where they're looking at different bioplastics and injection molding for creating records. How that will be adopted and the cost to do so is another sort of area that is of concern. And additionally, they're still using traditional lacquer cutting and electroplating in order to get to the, injection molding process. So you're still, going back to that 1 manufacturer in order to have the beginning part of the process started. So the more people that we can diversify this industry with, the more we can innovate and make really cool things happen.
I see a question from Niall Thomas. Niall, do you want to jump in and pose your question?
Yeah, I can do. Thank you. That's it's really fascinating. I think it's just reaching out as educators to sort of say, what can we do in our curriculum to help initiatives like this? So there's quite a few organisations in the UK, particularly, that are doing similar things around record production. But what pieces of advice would you have for us as educators to help you along and kind of like diversify our student body?
Well, I think one thing that we are hoping to do is really these master classes and, giving the kind of nuts to bolts on how records are made in order for people who are maybe in audio engineering programs to learn about these other pathways. I think once that happens and once they start seeing these things delivered by people like them, then they will feel more comfortable in approaching the types of education and career paths available. I find a lot of times that people don't see people like them and they feel scared to ask. I mean, one of the things Turntable Lab was doing a while back was these things that you need to know but are afraid to ask, like how to set up your turntable, how to change your needle. There are things that people need to know, but that barrier of entry, because of this whole like boys club kind of mentality, creates a place where they're scared to approach people about it. So I think creating that inclusive space and allowing for different people to come in and present that information is a big help.
Okay, I think we're
that's the end of our time. We are exactly back on schedule. So
we're back on schedule. It's perfect. So thank you so much, Jen, and we'll move to Gary. Gary, if you want to start sharing your slides, I will talk about you for a minute. So Gary Brumham is a composer, artist, music producer, and mix engineer who holds a PhD from Queen Mary University. He's worked with many successful artists and songwriters. Listen to these names: Bjork, George Michael, Sheryl Crow, Bow Wow Wow, The Tubes, Robbie Neville, Eddie Money, and The Fix. Gary teaches production at the Academy of Contemporary Music in Guildford. Recent publications investigate timbral perception and work on AI-based intelligent music systems. He's currently tracking his forthcoming album at Real World Studios in Bath, UK. His book, Distortion in Music Production, co-edited with Austin Moore, is available through Routledge. So welcome, Gary.
Thanks very much, Laurie, and welcome everyone. And thank you for letting us disrupt your day. Yeah, the pressure there with that, with all those wonderful artists. So I'm just going to pick up really. I'm going to approach this from a slightly different angle to Austin. I'm going to talk a little bit more about language and what happens in the studio, and really mapping I guess the semantic space, so the technical space, and this is becoming more and more relevant and, shall we say, problematic in terms of intelligent music systems or AI. How we already touched on this earlier, how we define certain terminology and what that means in a more scientific technical space. We've already done that bit, so I'm not going to do that. That will sound, there's a very thin line between confidence and arrogance, isn't there? So we'll talk a little bit, just speaking to the book, the subtitle here, The Soul of Sonics. This was actually a conversation I had with Spike Stemp when I interviewed him. He was one of my interviewees. And what became apparent to me quite quickly was this very kind of esoteric nature to distortion. They all found it very difficult to actually define it technically, but very easy to articulate it from, shall we say, a more kind of artistic or aesthetic kind of standpoint. And nowhere is that I guess exemplified better than in this this quote. When I emailed Flood, I used to assist Flood actually at Trident Studios, and I said to him, would you be prepared to share some of your tricks and talk about some of your techniques? And sorry, I'm just going to try and get rid of the chat actually, because it's blocking half of my presentation. 1 second, sorry about this. It's just that I have the chat. And I can't actually see any of my slides because the chat is appearing up on the right-hand side. How do I get rid of that, Joe? In fact, it won't even let me come out of the presentation. 1 second, let me just try to get rid of this. That's great. Sorry about that, everyone.
Yes, fun fact, if you're on a Mac, it's Command-Shift-H is the shortcut.
Fantastic. Great, we get to be more geeky. I can't see any of you now, so I'm just going to be, I'm speaking to my screen. Yeah, I just want to come back to this quote from Flood, which was actually was an email. It would be lovely to talk about a subject that's very close to my heart, ears, and soul. I think it would be great for Alan Mulder and I to do this together, as we have very different methods, but similar taste, perception, and application of one of the most misunderstood tools in the sonic palette. I'm around and ready to spill the beans, which I thought was completely hilarious. And actually, when I went to interview them both, it was interesting that Alan was able to articulate it much better than Flood. Flood actually needed to show me rather than, or he needed to play me something more than actually sit and chat about it, which I thought was interesting. So I just want to talk a little bit. I'm not going to, I've actually just taken a little of the abstract out. So I'm going to just talk a little today about the language and terminology that producers and engineers use to communicate with one another. And in terms of distortion, descriptors of such sonic anomalies and non-linearities means very different things to different groups of people. I just wanted to kind of emphasize that at the beginning of this. It's very much a kind of esoteric, abstract kind of thing in terms of describing what distortion does. So I guess one of the first problems that we have, I've already mentioned this very briefly, is this idea of, is it technical or is it artistic, aesthetic, however you want to describe that? And the answer is it's both. And trying to kind of navigate those two spaces and reconcile those two spaces, particularly in the case of distortion, seemed quite pertinent to me. I quite like this when we're talking about the role of an audio engineer. You know, what is audio engineering? What does what does an audio engineer do? Be it mix, recording engineer. I thought this was quite a good kind of synopsis from Roy Izaki, the process in which multi-track material, whether it's recorded, sampled, or synthesized, is balanced, treated, and combined into a multi-channel format. A more artistic description being one that does justice to music, is that a mix is a sonic presentation of emotions, creative ideas, and performance. And indeed, this was very prevalent in the interviews, this idea that mixing is essentially about delivering emotional context in music. And I guess the kind of the thing that interested me was the fact that all of the people I interviewed said, "Oh, I'm not technical. Don't ask me any technical questions." And what happens when you start to unpick that, you find that they're very technical. And one of the observations that we make with engineers is that they carry around an awful lot of tacit knowledge where they just know stuff and it's just a given. And then you'd interrogate the people who you're interviewing and they suddenly go, "Oh yeah, well, that's a given, isn't it?" And you're thinking, well, actually, no, that isn't a given. That almost needs to be more explicit. In terms of specifically about distortion, I guess a scientific explanation for that, or a scientific definition, the shape of the output waveform deviates from the input, which I guess, so it's very interesting for me how distortion in music production is construed as a very positive thing, whereas in many, if you were to think about building a structure, you know, a building, that would not be, distortion's a bad thing. So it's interesting how that perception has changed. I see the same thing in photography, actually. So the idea, and it was very relevant to my PhD, of creating, if we talk about creating a retro sound, quite often blurring the image or obfuscating the clarity of either an image or a piece of audio, sometimes that's a goal. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to escape from this idea of everything being very clear. Just going back, I guess speaking slightly to what Austin was talking about earlier. So I acknowledge the fact that there are many different manifestations. I'm speaking specifically about harmonic coloration and saturation in the studio. But I also acknowledge the kind of background where this came from. I'm thinking people like Link Ray and Jackie Breniston, the Kinks, You Really Got Me, and the Torn kind of speaker. So I guess this kind of points to this idea of it's an unintended kind of consequence of technological limitations. And if I think about when I joined as a tape op at Trident Studios, minimizing distortion was definitely the goal. And I noticed earlier that Phil Harding is it. Sorry, Phil, I'm calling you out here. It was definitely, when I came into engineering, it was definitely, the goal was to minimize distortion. But something interesting happened in this transition from analog to digital technology. And you see a change in attitude. And I really like this little, when I spoke to Julian Rogers, when he talked about, to the frustration of many of those engineers who spent their careers trying to eradicate imperfections, as soon as we managed to remove them, we wanted them back again. And I see this in the digital domain specifically. And when I spoke to Chad Blake, he talked a lot about having to try and recreate some of that kind of feeling in the digital domain and how difficult that was. It kind of happened very naturally, and we got a kind of acclimatized to it in the analog domain, and how that's changed. Just a small, I guess, kind of graphic representation of what distortion. So you can see on the right the kind of clipped sine wave there. I guess the thing that I was really interested in, that this also preoccupied me for a lot of my PhD, was the idea of semantics. And Austin has already talked a lot about this idea of cross-modal perception and semantic crosstalk. And Zachary Walmart talks a lot about this, about metaphors and how they reflect and shape how we perceive and appraise musical sound. And I guess a good example of that would be, Austin mentioned something similar earlier. You know, when you have a conversation with somebody and you say, "Oh, that sounds muddy," and they come back and they say, "Well, actually, it's very interesting. That sounds warm to me." So everyone's, I guess we're all right and we're all wrong. And it's how we perceive that sound. And it was very interesting in my interviews, the way that distortion was described. Similar kind of thing, I guess in terms of timbre perception, and I'm thinking of kind of people like Stephen McAdams here, I use a very loose definition. It's everything that isn't pitch and time. And I guess I came to the word color. So this idea of timbre perception is very, very closely related to semantics. And actually, if you look at the work of Satis and Zacharakis there, you'll see they talk a lot about timbre semantics. So the idea of these two being inextricably kind of entwined and working together. I also looked at, speaking of sound, Tom Porcello's work, the need for experience, and how I can remember when I went to work in a studio for the first time, I just didn't understand what the hell anyone was on about. And I think this is almost taken as a given, where we have to learn a set of terminology and descriptors to be able to operate in the studio. Going back to a question that you raised, Laurie, earlier, this idea of an ontology of audio descriptors, actually there has been a fair amount of work in this area now. And I'm thinking of this audio commons hierarchical ontology. I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. Unfortunately, it's so kind of large. It was very, very tricky to get that on one page. This Shep's parallel particles is very interesting. We've got air, thick, bite, and sub. Now, it occurs to me that this is much safer in the hands of somebody that does know what they're doing than somebody that doesn't know what they're doing with an audio plugin. However, it's probably designed for somebody that doesn't know what the hell they're doing. So there's almost this kind of contradiction there in audio. This is a picture of the ontology. I recommend, you can see the green area is related to attributes of distortion. So if you want to go and check that out, I've got some references at the end. I'm gonna have to zip through this. So just in terms of how I went about this, semi-structured in-person interviews. Some of them were sitting in the room with people, and then COVID came along and I had to do them on Zoom, but all of them were recorded, transcribed. I fed most of it into NVivo. I don't know if any of you use that, where I was doing some comparative data analysis. And really trying to just look for emerging themes and clusters, just things that where there was agreement or disagreement, where there was similarity or dissimilarity in terms of descriptors. And what emerged was these different themes that I'm going to just draw. All I'm going to do is I'm just going to mention these in passing and talk about some of the comments that came from the producers. So in terms of experience, this was interesting. Attention to sound for its own sake has become deeply embedded in studio work. So has the need for engineering professionals to be able to discuss it in finely detailed ways. But I thought the most pertinent part was this. The problem is how to render acoustic phenomena concretely in language. Chad Blake, similarly, the whole thing about words and being a messenger and being a receiver, everybody hears things differently and hears words differently. And I guess the other pertinent thing in terms of when I spoke to Chad about how he would articulate, and I kept referring to the sound and similarity with things in the analog domain and familiarity. And he said, actually, I'm not really that interested. I mix everything in the box. I don't care whether it sounds the same. I just want it to feel the same. So bringing this idea of how something feels and navigating this technical versus artistic parameter space. I guess we're definitely here today to talk about subversion and misappropriation. I thought it was worth mentioning, even though it doesn't specifically refer to distortion, this quotation from Kim Casgrone. I think it's in the book Audio Culture that some of you have probably read. Sometimes not knowing the theoretical operation of a tool can result in more interesting results by thinking out of the box. And I think it appears that the more technology that's thrown at a problem, the more boring the results. And I think specifically of the Fairchild. The Fairchild, I always used to use the Fairchild on the end of my mix bus, but I never compressed with it, but it's a compressor. The harmonic distortion, the attributes, were far more interesting to me than the compression. So the idea of changing the intended purpose. Similarly, Danton Supple, who's a recording engineer, he was talking about being fearful of making mistakes, but it occurred to him that he kind of liked some of the things that were happening in some of the attributes of the distortion. This was an interesting area, perceived loudness, because quite often you see, particularly, shall we say, slightly less experienced engineers, they tend to, they'll put a limiter on the end of their mix, and they'll be like, well, why can I not make my mix as loud as yours? It's like this kind of competitive. And I think distortion is the kind of secret sauce for loudness. Why? Because it rounds off transients, which I'll talk about in a moment, and it enables you to create more average level, I guess, more loudness. And Alan Moulder referred to this. Distortion is the creative alternative to simply pushing up a fader. I use it more for sitting something in lower. And actually something Flood said to me, he said, oh, I use distortion when I want to turn something down, which I thought was quite astute. And it that kind of feeds, I guess, into Spike Stent's comment here about the mix bus. And he said for years and years, my mixes were really disappointing to me. And it was only when I started to really push the SSL into the red when things got really interesting. And I found that if I drove the channels more, it started gluing together in a nice way. I already mentioned this very briefly, the compression effect, as a lot of them called it. Taming transient, so saturating. Of course, you can change the envelope of a sound with a compressor, but actually doing it with distortion, you can often yield far more interesting results. When you shape transients and you saturate transients, it's really interesting to see what happens. And it kind of speaks to some of the work I did in my PhD in terms of creating a retro sound, where you start maybe with something which is typically a square wave, and you round off the edges, you change the envelope, and of course that alters the perception. And one of those attributes could be creating a retro sound. Harmonic content. This was interesting for me. Dave Bascom, when I interviewed when I talked to him about distortion, he talked about EQ for free, which I thought was a very astute thing. So the idea of adding harmonics to a sound rather than just reaching for an EQ, maybe adding some second order, which tends to be slightly smoother, or third order harmonics, which tends to be slightly more angular or edgy. So the idea of adding some distortion to create a space for a sound within a mix. And Andrew Scheps actually anecdotally said to me, I think the most interesting thing about an API EQ is its distortion properties, quite possibly not the fact that it's an EQ. Conscious of time, so I'm moving forward here. Sound staging, just in terms of creating contrast. I really like this quote from Chad actually here that I pulled out. If you want to bring something out of the muck, you have no other tool but to make everything else worse. That's what you got to do. So if you have a whole track that was distorted, but you wanted the vocal to sound clear, but the vocal wasn't clear, it was kind of distorted, well, just distort the whole rest of the track, and now the vocal will sound a lot clearer. And I think this is very interesting in terms of depth, creating depth in a mix, of forwarding things in a mix or pushing them back. We tend to think of that as a timing or a space thing, but actually compression and distortion are a great way of moving stuff forward or pushing it back into a mix. And Alan talked about all the small differences stacked up, making a massive difference. So the idea of it being accumulative with distortion, adding small bits of distortion in many different places rather than just slapping it on one thing. Very briefly, distortion to me signifies danger. It's danger. And when you hear it, you're programmed to go, fuck, look around. It's fight or flight. And actually, it was very interesting how Chad talked about when he was a kid, his parents, they used to take him to air shows, and he hated air shows, and the sound of the planes, the jet fighters, just frightened the life out of him. And he said, I'm always trying to go back to that place when I'm adding distortion in a mix. Trina Shoemaker, who was Sheryl Crow's engineer, and I think Brandy Carlisle now, she was very esoteric in the way she described distortion to me. This idea of it not really being a paint color, it's a paint thinner. It's used to change color and look at everything visually, olfactorily, and sonically when I'm mixing. I go on a whole journey when I'm doing a mix. So that for me was very interesting, this idea of kind of reference points in nature. Finally, final slide, apart from my conclusion, just the idea of taste. It doesn't necessarily refer specifically to distortion, but it occurs to me that a lot of the engineers that I really who had a big influence on me, they were those that could use distortion in a very creative way. And I guess Gareth sums this up quite well, really. Gareth Jones sums this up when he talks about the idea of taste. And it could be that one person really hates your mix, another person really loves, and he does a lot of work with Nick Cave, and he used to work with Depeche Mode. And he talked about just tuning in on the distortion. The distortion was where these artists would get the emotion in the music from. I'm just going to sum this up because I don't want to overstay my welcome here. Just 2 or 3 observations here I just want to make. I already made the point, I guess, that it's kind of easy to define technically than aesthetically. I've gone some way to try and extract some of the, I guess, some of the terminology and the way that audio feels based upon how it's described. I already mentioned this idea of blurring or distorting a sound, that an in-focus sound, in the same way an in-focus image is not always the goal. Challenging to map semantic descriptors to a definitive parameter space, which is, of course, very problematic for intelligent audio systems or intelligent music systems or mixing systems. Interestingly, some of you may want to go and check out the SAFE plugin. SAFE means it's an acronym for Semantic Audio Feature Extraction, where you maybe it's EQ, distortion, reverb, but what you're also asked to do is to describe the sound that you've just created. And this is all stored on a central server back at Birmingham City University or Queen Mary University. I could say so much more, but I'm not going to. I'm going to stop that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Was I over time, Joe? I bet I was, wasn't I?
You were very disciplined.
Okay.
Thank you, Gary.
I think we're okay. Yeah.
Good.
Wow.
1926.
I feel like you've taken me so far in my understanding of this from that conversation a long time ago, and I always pull out that wheel that you brought up in your slides, and so it's just nice to feel like this is coming to such fruition. You know, this is really productive work for all of us to be thinking about. I was thinking about Phil. Phil, you're there. Do you want to jump in and say anything about some of the comments that Gary's made? It's great to have you here with us.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I come from the opposite end, you know, and the only comment I would add is that I didn't participate in those interviews with Gary and Austin because I've never liked distortion and I've never believed in it, as you may hear from the records I've been involved with in the pop world. And so I think it's fantastic that the guys have done the research they've done, and I think we'd all agree that not just distortion, but a full ontology of audio descriptors is vital work in the academic world. And it's so difficult for young students, I think, and people new to the industry to understand how a lot of experienced people use their terminology in the studio. So I think this is fantastic work going on. I'm afraid I've got very little to add to the conversation, but thank you.
Oh, I think you just added tremendously there. I think what you said is so very true, that we're focusing today on distortion and a kind of lexicon for that, but we need it across the board. We need it, for all different tools that we use. Rob Toulson isn't in the room, I don't think, but I remember his talks. Always compression is distortion would be his mantra, right? And those kinds of comments have always been really eye-opening for me and valuable. So with that said, do we want to invite other questions? Joe, hello, Joe.
Yeah, I was going to jump in with I'm not a producer, I'm a musicologist, but I love listening to mixes and working out what's going on. So in the physics of the thing, Gary, I'm actually maybe talking more to your engineer and producer's brain than to your academic brain here. A couple of the comments were very similar there. The idea that you can reduce an instrument in the mix when there are a greater number of upper harmonics created by distortion, which is very interesting and usable technique. So this is my rookie question. In psychology of listening, is there a term for that phenomenon that listeners can do, particularly with the bass end, of inferring the fundamental by only hearing the upper harmonics? Because, you know, speaking as a parent of a young adult, he's drive me crazy when she would try and listen to whole pop tracks just on the iPhone speaker. But you could kind of hear the bass line even with the high pass filtering that an iPhone speaker does. So we must be inferring that fundamental, hearing a bass note that actually isn't there in the mix. So is that a usable technique for engineers, is my question?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great question, Joe. And those of us that are engineers here will definitely lament that problem we have. It's interesting you mentioned bass, because bass, it always has low end, but you can never hear, quite often it's difficult to hear the notes, the note definition. And usually the tool I'll resort to is I'll either send it out through a real amplifier, or I'll use a plugin. And it's very interesting how a lot of the plugins that we use, they tend to, this goes back to misappropriation, actually. The idea that they're designed for a specific purpose, usually guitars, but they actually sound much nicer on other instruments in a mix. And I guess just in terms of creating definition and going back to that idea of bass, adding harmonics, I think one of the most difficult things to get your head around when you start engineering is that you're not always EQing the fundamental. Quite often you are, maybe you're not doing it consciously. I'm not sitting there with a kind of spectrogram thinking, oh, right, okay, 100 hertz, I need to add 200, 400, 800. I'm not thinking like that. It's usually a feel thing, but actually engineers intuitively will know where to find those frequencies. So quite often you will EQ the harmonic rather than the fundamental to bring some of those sounds out, which is why distortion is a great way of bringing definition out in some of the instruments in a mix. Sorry, very long answer there, Joe.
Oh, that's helpful. I think Austin and Mike had a question. Thanks, Gary.
Go ahead, Austin.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it was actually just to lead on to your question, Joe. We have a PhD student that's exploring the impact of distortion in drum and bass music, and he actually went back and interviewed a load of the producers and engineers from back in the 90s, whenever drum and bass music was emerging in the UK. And he found out that one of the main reasons that the producers started to distort the bass was when they were driving home from the studio in their car with their small little speaker systems. They just couldn't hear the sub bass. So that was one of the motivations for the guys to start putting distortion on the bass lines. And then obviously it just went from there. But it kind of ties into the point that you were asking Gary.
Thank you.
Mike, go ahead.
Yes. I haven't yet read the book that you and Austin have co-edited, but I'm wondering if there's much genre-specific analysis, because as you were going through the anecdotes about distortion, I kept thinking about dub reggae and the way in which that often inverts the use of distortion that we see in other genres. So I'm just wondering if you're considering that aspect and also the idea that the lexicography may be affected by the cultural contexts across different genres.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. Oh, what happened there? What happened?
We can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
All of a sudden, I slide, and I thought I'd been cut off. Yeah, absolutely. We did. I mean, there's a great chapter towards the end of the book by Tom Williams, where he talks about distortion in jazz guitar and talks a lot about John Scofield. And traditionally, jazz was not seen as a place where you would use a lot of distortion. And he was talking about how that kind of attitude has changed. So yeah, absolutely. And certainly in terms of dub reggae, I mean, using the mixing desk, or I'm not talking like a large scale mixing console, but using a lot of people who I work with in the studio who are very much influenced by that genre of music. They distort the mixing console in a very, probably in a way that you would listen to it and you go, is that really is that really a viable creative decision? But when it works in the context of a mix, there's something that kind of glues the sound together, which is coherent. And I guess this also highlights another problem with using distortion. Sorry, I'm steering a little off mic, but hopefully I'll come back to it. Is the idea of listening to it in isolation and listening to it in context. Distortion can only really be appreciated in context of other instrumentation. I mean, we all know about masking, but I guess the idea of, and it's a very simple experiment to do with your students, where you get them to focus on a kick drum and a bass, and you add either some distortion or maybe you equalize it a little, and you say, which one am I processing? And invariably they get it wrong, because so the idea of all of the sound being seen as one or heard as one, I think is really, really important. And I think certainly for me, if I'm thinking about distortion as a stylistic thing, I mean, certainly what Skrillex is doing with distortion, which is clip distortion, is very, very different, I guess, to if you go back and you listen to Dark Side of the Moon, or you go back and I don't know, you go back and listen to a Steely Dan album, something. There's obviously distortion there, but it's a very different type of distortion. So I think the idea of stylistics that is appropriate to genre is definitely something I would be thinking about. I don't know if you want to add anything to this, Austin.
I'm not sure we can really take the time. This is fascinating. Sorry. And I see other hands up, but I think we might have to move on to our conclusion, just so that people get on to the next part of their day, which might include teaching, or it might include having dinner.
Laurie, can I make one very, very quick point, and I'll try and make it in 30 seconds. I just wanted to thank Jen for her presentation. And yes. I wanted to, maybe a separate conversation. It's very interesting, Jen. The female producers that I interviewed, we're talking sort of Sylvia Massey and Trina Shoemaker and Catherine Marks, had a very different perception of distortion to the male participants. And it's something we should probably, all of us, talk about, is this way audio is perceived, and whether there is anything different that we observe between genders. So yeah, I just wanted to make that point very, very quickly, because it occurred to me when you were making your very interesting presentation.
Fantastic. I feel like the list of to-dos in our research world has increased in a very wonderful way. So thank you, all three speakers. Really dynamic and terrific presentations today with such different perspectives. So thank you very much. And I will turn back to Veronica now, who probably wants to close out with a few more comments.
Yes, so just a kind of reminder of our two big announcements. The journal call for papers is out for the Journal of Music Production Research. So if you follow that link, you get to the introduction page at JMPR, which links to the call for submission itself, which is a Google Doc. There we go. We don't have a theme as such for the inaugural issue, kind of trying to capture lots of different things in the community. We know that some people have expressed that there is a gap or has been for a while, so we're trying to make space for that. We have the journal guidelines there as well for kind of formatting a submission as such. And what I didn't mention at the start was, of course, our co-editors, Mike Elaine and Austin Moore, are here as well. Mike and Austin, do you want to say anything?
Well, I think the CFP covers most of the territory, but we would just encourage everyone who's here to consider getting the enterprise off the ground and making a submission.
Yeah. Similarly, yeah, I'm really, really pleased to be part of this, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to these submissions and yeah, driving this journal forward.
Thank you. So, should say as well that we're opening it up to articles, interviews, reviews. So anything that might fit into the area, feel free. And if you want to reach out to anyone to talk about any ideas or if it might work, again, get in touch. We very much encourage that. So again, deadline 26th of January for those journal submissions. The second big announcement of the in-person conference, 13th to 15th of September 2024 at Leeds Beckett University. Hopefully, exciting event. The call for papers isn't out for that yet, but we're aiming to have it out probably around February time, so just after the deadline for the journal. We're starting the planning process, so as soon as we have more information available via the mailing list and on the website as well. Anyone from the steering committee want to add anything on that?
Just to encourage everyone to use what we used to call multimedia back in the 90s. You know, we're an auditory field, and we are looking at this is going to be an exclusively online journal, so you can have any media you like. You can have embedded audio, shared cloud files, embedded video, and our platform, we're currently auditioning a couple of platforms, but it will be essentially, I suppose I'm not really selling it well to describe it as a blog type format, but technically it will have all the things a blog can have. So there would be an opportunity for any media that you want. So I would encourage everyone in our community to think about, you know, going beyond just a plain text article if your particular field of research warrants it, and to make as much use of cloud-based technologies as necessary to get your research across.
Yeah, and in similar with that, we're committed to open access, and we're committed to trying to make the conference as hybrid as possible, although kind of recognizing the limitations of technology, but we are exploring the different kind of paths for that, try and make it as accessible as we possibly can. I think that's it really, kind of just on time. Those are the big kind of dates and deadlines, like we said, all on the website in the events calendar, and any forthcoming events we'll kind of publish on the website and mailing list as well. So thank you very much for joining us and continued support, and thank you for everyone who's becoming a member. It's so exciting.
Thanks, everyone. And I couldn't think of a better play-out track than the second half of Billie Eilish's Happier Than Ever, where the entire master bus is distorted. Yay!